For the next painting in this series, I decided that I was going to do Apathy. Once I'd sketched out the original pattern, I transferred it onto the paper that I wanted to work with. And then for the galaxy, what I decided to use is inks. I really liked how they looked with the last painting that I did, so I thought instead of using watercolour, which is one of the mediums I'm a bit more comfortable with, I thought I would use inks. And also inks kind of scare me a little bit because unlike watercolour, which to a certain degree you can lift the colour off once you put it on, once you put the ink down, that's it, it's done. So I really wanted to challenge myself and try and use some of the tools that I have, which I don't use very often just because I'm scared of using them and messing them up. And then if I did mess up, just to work around the problem and try and fix it. And that did happen a few times throughout this painting, so I'll show you what I did. I used a mixture of colours. I used some pinks, I used some purples, quite a bit of orange, some blues and even some greens as well. And what I did is I used a wet and wet technique, so I made the area that I wanted to put the ink on quite damp and then let the ink kind of work on its own. Sometimes I'd move it around a little bit, but I'd try and follow where the ink went naturally and then work that into other colours and gradually get them all to blend together. Unfortunately, once I'd put all those colours down, I wanted to use a Parker ink, which I found out bleeds really badly, which was really frustrating because it meant that I had to go over the outline of the painting later on just to try and thicken up the line so that you couldn't see that the edges had bled. And it just wasn't a very good ink, so in the end I decided to switch from using the sable brushes, which you can load up quite heavily, and switch to a synthetic one, which was a little bit lighter, and then gradually work that colour onto the paper so that way it meant that I didn't have the colour bleeding all over the place, and just worked on smaller areas and with a lot less water loaded into the brush. One thing I was quite careful to do was to not make it too dark around this particular character's head, just because I wanted to make it look a little bit like there was a light behind him, but that just wasn't reflecting onto the character. I wanted to paint this really beautiful, vibrant galaxy behind him, which just seemed to have no effect on the character in this particular painting. And that's what I wanted, that contrast of this really bright, beautiful background, and then this fading figure in front of it that's just completely uninterested. Now this one was a very interesting part of the painting. You see those two little dots which I've circled? I found out that this ink really isn't good if the paper is wet at all or even slightly damp, and what started to happen is those two little dots started to bleed, and when I tried to blend them out, they didn't blend out very well, so I figured I'd hide them by just painting a massive galaxy on top of them, which worked out quite well. And in the meantime I waited for the rest of the paper to dry and then gradually added all those little stars. Now this was my favourite part of the whole painting, figuring out that the pan pastels work really beautifully over ink. I used two colours, a white which had a tendency to wash out the colours underneath, so I used that quite sparingly, and then I switched to another colour which was a very pale greeny blue, and then used that on top of the white, and that made it really stand out. And what I liked about it is then afterwards I could go over with the white ink, which had a tendency to pull up the colour from the inks underneath it, but if I had the pan pastel over the inks on the bottom of the paper and then I applied the white ink on top of that, it didn't soak up the colours from the ink because it had the pan pastels as a barrier. So it fixed a lot of the problems I was having with the ink and just made it all stand out a lot better. After that I started outlining, and I used the very smallest pen that I have, and I got this pen mainly just because it doesn't bleed, and after I'd had a really horrible experience with a previous painting I worked on where I'd painted it and then I used a pen which just bled all over the place and wrecked it. So I got this pen specifically so I could do all those little details, but then I used a thicker pen later on for the outside, which also is very good and doesn't bleed, but it just meant it saved me time. I could do all the detailed work on the hair and the hands with a thinner pen, and then I used the thicker pen for the outside. After that I needed to colour in the actual character, and I wanted this to all be done in pencil, no colour whatsoever, and I wanted to take my graphite pen and I had to sharpen it out and make it much thinner. Normally I use a knife to sharpen my pencils just because I find that with some pencils the lead tends to crack if you use a pencil sharpener, and a knife gives me a bit more control over the shape that I want. So that's normally what I do, and especially with a graphite pen I'll normally save the shavings because it's really useful for later, and I'll show you in a minute what I've been saving them for. So I just started applying that colour and then blending it out with old makeup brushes. I've already done an entire video on all the different tools that I use to blend, so if you want I will link that down in the description box, or you can have a look for it through my channel. and I just kept adding all the shadows. At first I just focused on the obvious areas like around the mouth, anywhere there's going to be some very, well, obvious shadows, and then bit by bit I started adding the detail, but I always wanted to start with the most obvious things and then gradually work onto the details. For me at least, I find it's a mistake to go straight into the details because it's very easy to get carried away and then just completely forget about the rest of the painting, or the drawing in this case. So I kept adding all those colours, blending. I'll normally start out light and then gradually darken so that way I don't have to try and erase something, and it means you're less likely to make mistakes if you do it bit by bit and slowly. I started to add the freckles. I just thought the freckles worked a little bit better with this character, especially since we've got this galaxy in the background, and I didn't want his skin to be completely... what's the word I'm looking for? I just thought the freckles looked nice, that's to be honest. So I just added the freckles, gave him a few on his cheeks, on his nose, a tiny bit on the forehead which you can't see very well, and then carried on focusing on the hands and the hair. And then I kept using those graphite shavings, especially for the areas where I wanted that colour to be a tiny bit darker and I really wanted to be able to work it into the paper. After that I just went back with my really tiny mechanical pencil, added in any of the last little details that I wanted to, and that's pretty much it. I'm done. As usual, once I finished, one of the things I did is I took the original sketch that I'd done, outlined it neatly and made that available up on my Patreon, so if any of you wanted to take this drawing and recreate it in your own style, go ahead, it's up on my Patreon. I'll have a link in the description box and I'll have a new video for you soon.